At midnight on August 19th, a 50% tariff wall goes up between the United States and Canada. $20 billion in Canadian goods hit that wall in a matter of hours. And the single biggest demand sitting behind that number, a demand the Trump administration has repeated for months, has just been rejected, flatly, by the province that started this fight in the first place. This is not a threat anymore. This is a countdown that is now measured in hours, not weeks, and Ottawa is not backing down. To understand why a fight over wine bottles and whiskey shelves has escalated into one of the most consequential trade standoffs of Donald Trump's second term, you have to go back to the spring of 2025. That's when Trump first slapped a wave of tariffs on Canadian goods, accusing Ottawa of everything from fentanyl trafficking failures to unfair trade barriers. Canada's response wasn't a tariff of its own, at least not at first. It was something more symbolic, and it turned out to be something far more stubborn. Provincial governments across the country, the bodies that actually control liquor sales in Canada, not the federal government in Ottawa, ordered American beer, wine, and spirits pulled off government store shelves. British Columbia went first. On March 10, 2025, Premier David Eby stood inside a government liquor store in Victoria and announced that the province's liquor distribution branch had stopped purchasing American alcohol entirely and was pulling existing stock. According to CBC News, Eby framed it as a direct response to what he called Trump's escalating threats. And he was blunt about the emotional undercurrent driving the decision. Many British Columbians, he said, simply didn't want to see American products on the shelf anymore. Quebec followed. Ontario followed. By the summer of 2025, nearly every Canadian province had joined the boycott, and the numbers started to show it fast. According to a White House fact sheet released in July 2026, Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages collapsed by roughly 81% between March 2025 and February 2026, compared to the same period a year earlier. A fall from about $718 million down to just $137 million. For American liquor producers, Canada had been their largest export market in the world. That market didn't just shrink, it nearly vanished. And it wasn't just alcohol. The same White House fact sheet noted Canadian imports of American motor vehicles dropped by about 22%, or $5.6 billion, over roughly the same window, with buyers turning to other countries to fill the gap left by American automakers. Two provinces broke ranks. Alberta and Saskatchewan, both with conservative-aligned governments, reversed their bans in June 2025 and quietly put American liquor back on shelves. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith made clear her province had no intention of rejoining the boycott, even as pressure mounted from Ottawa and from other provinces to present a unified front. It created, in effect, two different Canadas at the negotiating table, one still boycotting, one that had already folded. And that split matters enormously to what happened next. Because on July 20th, 2026, Donald Trump used a rarely invoked piece of trade law, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, to impose new 50% tariffs on a wide category of Canadian goods. And this time, it didn't matter whether those goods were compliant with the existing USMCA trade agreement or not. According to a legal alert from the trade law firm Wiley, the tariffs cover close to $20 billion in annual Canadian imports into the United States, hitting products from hockey sticks to wine to cement. Section 338 gives a sitting president the power to impose these duties when he determines a foreign country is discriminating against American goods compared to how it treats imports from everywhere else. In three separate proclamations, Trump made exactly that determination against Canada, specifically in three sectors: dairy, alcoholic beverages, and motor vehicles. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went public defending the move, calling the 50% tariff a matter of what he termed reciprocity, a response, in his framing, to discriminatory Canadian trade practices, and he pointed directly at the provincial alcohol restrictions as the clearest example. The White House fact sheet went further, laying out Canada's dairy system as a specific grievance too, noting that Canada's tariff rate quotas on American cheese are, in the administration's words, far more restrictive than the quotas Canada applies to cheese coming in from the European Union, despite Canada having trade agreements with both. To really grasp how we got to a 50% tariff wall, you need the fuller timeline, because this didn't start with alcohol at all. According to a Congressional Research Service brief tracking U.S. Canada trade relations, the current trade war formally began on February 1st, 2025, when Trump signed orders imposing near-universal tariffs on goods from both Canada and Mexico, citing emergency powers tied to fentanyl trafficking. Canada didn't sit still. Within days, Ottawa announced matching 25% tariffs on up to $155 billion in American imports, and by March 13, 2025, those retaliatory measures had solidified into roughly $20 billion in duties targeting American steel, aluminum, and a wide range of consumer goods, according to the trade tracking outlet Just the Facts. Then came the sectoral tariffs. In March 2025, Trump eliminated nearly all country exemptions, including Canada's, from Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. A move the Congressional Research Service confirms pushed the rate as high as 50% by June of the year. April brought 25% tariffs on vehicles and auto parts, though USMCA-compliant vehicles and parts using American content were carved out. Canada matched steel and aluminum blow for blow and separately imposed 25% retaliatory tariffs specifically on American autos, covering roughly $30 billion in trade, according to the Tax Foundation's ongoing tariff tracker. There was, briefly, a thaw. On August 22, 2025, Prime Minister Carney stood at a press conference and announced Canada would roll back most of its 25% retaliatory tariffs. Orange juice, clothing, appliances, even motorcycles came off the list starting September 1st, in what Reuters described as an apparent gesture of goodwill aimed at restarting stalled trade talks. But Carney was careful about what he kept. The tariffs on American autos, steel, and aluminum stayed exactly where they were. As CNBC reported at the time, that distinction wasn't an accident. Those three sectors represent the industrial core of the dispute, and Ottawa wasn't willing to give up leverage there even while extending an olive branch elsewhere. That olive branch didn't hold for long. On October 25, 2025, Trump announced an additional 10% tariff hike on Canadian goods, and the trigger, according to Just the Facts timeline, was almost bizarrely specific. An Ontario government advertisement featuring footage of former President Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs, which aired during the negotiations and reportedly angered Trump enough that he escalated in response. It's a detail that captures just how personality-driven and volatile this entire trade relationship has become. A single ad campaign from a Canadian province triggering a new national tariff hike. Underneath all of this, the dairy dispute has its own long history that predates the current standoff entirely. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative has challenged Canada's dairy tariff rate quota system twice, already under the existing USMCA framework, with what the Congressional Research Service describes as mixed results, meaning Washington hasn't fully won that fight through the trade agreement's own dispute mechanisms. In response, rather than loosening its dairy protections, Canada's Parliament went the other direction in June 2025, enacting legislation that explicitly bars the federal government from increasing dairy, poultry, or egg quotas, or reducing the tariffs applied above those quotas in any future trade negotiation. That's a law, not a policy preference, which means even if a future Canadian government wanted to concede on dairy to strike a broader deal with Washington, it would need to repeal domestic legislation first just to have that option. And hovering over every round of these negotiations is a bigger structural deadline that has nothing to do with alcohol or tariffs at all, the scheduled joint review of the entire USMCA agreement, set for 2026 under the treaty's own terms. The Congressional Research Service notes that review could lead to significant changes in the agreement itself, and any revisions would likely need congressional approval on the American side, given that Congress originally implemented USMCA through legislation. That review is part of why the current Phase 1 talks matter so much. Whatever gets negotiated now, under deadline pressure, could shape the baseline both sides bring in to that larger renegotiation. The financial toll of all this has been measured independently, too. The Tax Foundation's tariff tracker estimates that across all of Trump's 2025 and 2026 tariff actions combined, not just those aimed at Canada, the average American household absorbed roughly $900 in additional costs in 2026 alone and found no meaningful improvement in the overall U.S. trade balance as a result. On the Canadian side, Just the Facts reported that cross-border tourism took a direct hit too, with Canadian travel to the United States, particularly to Florida, dropping sharply through 2025. A decline that translated into billions of dollars in lost hospitality revenue and a projected shortfall for American tourism-dependent businesses heading into winter. That 50% tariff under Section 338 was set to take effect on August 19, 2026. As of the recording of this update, that deadline is now less than 24 hours away. What makes this moment different from the tariff threats that came before it is what's happening, or rather, what isn't happening, in the room where Canadian and American negotiators have been meeting. According to Bloomberg, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made a pledge more than a year ago after meeting with the country's provincial leaders, and he has repeated it consistently ever since. Canada will not accept a bad deal. That line has become something close to a mantra for his government throughout this entire standoff. On August 17th, just one day before this recording, Carney described the last-minute talks with Washington as delicate and intense, according to CBC News reporting by John Paul Tasker. Sources briefed on the negotiations told CBC that Canada wants the United States to scrap the Section 338 tariffs entirely before they take effect. And Carney's negotiating team is also pushing hard for tariff relief on sectors that have already been battered by more than a year of Trump's earlier levies, lumber chief among them. But U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has repeatedly signaled that Washington isn't interested in dropping its broader tariff regime, no matter what Canada offers in return. And at the very center of the impasse sits one single specific demand: end the provincial bans on American alcohol. This is the demand that this story's title refers to, and as of this recording, it has been refused repeatedly, publicly, and without ambiguity. CBC News reported that Canadian negotiators fear the looming tariffs may now be unavoidable precisely because Washington continues to insist on an end to the alcohol bans, and the provinces continue to refuse. Not privately, not through quiet diplomatic back channels, publicly, on camera, in front of reporters. Listen to how directly some of these provincial leaders have put it. British Columbia's David Eby told reporters gathered in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, where Canada's premiers had assembled for a summer meeting, "There is not a chance in hell that U.S. alcohol is going back on the shelf. Not a maybe, not a we're reviewing our options. A flat public refusal delivered directly into a wall of cameras." Ontario's Doug Ford took a similar line but tied it to a different condition. According to CBC and Bloomberg reporting, Ford said that unless the United States removes its industrial tariffs on automobiles and steel, Ontario will not lift its ban on American wine and spirits. He went further, calling Trump nothing but a bully, and argued that Canada needs to negotiate, in his words, through strength, not weakness, and needs to throw everything on the table. Even British Columbia's approach has evolved into something more than a boycott. It's become, in Eby's own framing, a deliberate strategic tool. In comments reported by Yahoo News, Eby said BC's alcohol ban has become one of Canada's most effective instruments in this trade dispute, and he pushed back against critics, including the province's own conservative opposition, who have urged him to lift the ban as a goodwill gesture. He wouldn't. He argued instead that the patchwork of different provincial approaches, some provinces boycotting, Alberta and Saskatchewan not, has actually benefited Canada by creating multiple, simultaneous lines of communication with U.S. officials rather than a single brittle negotiating channel that could snap under pressure. Saskatchewan's Scott Moe, whose province is one of the two that already lifted its ban, still framed the broader standoff in defiant terms. Before Carney addressed reporters in Charlottetown, Moe said he expected the Prime Minister to ask provinces to drop their alcohol restrictions to smooth the path toward a deal. But Moe himself called Trump nothing but a bully, too, according to the trade publication TT News, underlining that even provinces without an active ban aren't exactly sympathetic to Washington's position. Carney's own position threads a careful needle. He has said publicly that any decision to lift a provincial ban has to be made by the provinces themselves individually, and in his judgment, it should only happen as part of a broader, comprehensive agreement, not as a unilateral concession handed over before talks conclude. In other words, no free goodwill gesture. If the ban comes down, it comes down as part of a deal, or it doesn't come down at all. Washington's response to this wall of provincial defiance has been just as blunt. Jamieson Greer, touring a tire facility in Des Moines, Iowa on August 14th, told reporters, as reported by CBC's Darren Major, that the administration will not accept any form of retaliation from Canada if Trump follows through on the new tariff threat. That's a warning shot aimed squarely at Ottawa. Even if the 50% tariffs land and Canada wants to hit back with its own countermeasures, Washington is already signaling it will treat that retaliation as an escalation it won't tolerate. That threat matters, because retaliation is very much on the table in Ottawa. According to the Globe and Mail, which cited 5 separate sources familiar with the negotiations, if there is no deal by the Wednesday deadline and Trump's new tariffs come into force, Canada is expected to break off talks altogether and retaliate, not simply absorb the tariffs and keep talking, walk away and hit back. Now, it would be misleading to present this as though alcohol is the only issue on the table, because it isn't. It's simply the most visible, and the one Canada has refused most publicly. The Globe and Mail's sourcing lays out a far broader set of American demands that are shaping the structure of any eventual deal. Washington wants Canada to grant the United States a right of first refusal on purchasing critical minerals needed for the defense and technology sectors. It wants Ottawa to follow through on a long-delayed $88 billion purchase of F-35 fighter jets. It wants Canadian forces to buy American-made technology, including radar planes, as part of joining Trump's planned Golden Dome missile defense system. And it wants some kind of guarantee of increased oil and gas exports from Canada into the United States. According to those same sources, defense, critical minerals, and energy issues are expected to be negotiated in more detail during a later phase of talks. But progress, or the lack of it, on those fronts is already shaping what's happening in the current round. Some limited commitment on critical minerals might get written into what negotiators are calling a Phase 1 deal this week, even if it amounts to little more than a broad agreement from Canada to cooperate going forward, rather than binding commitments. If there is a deal before the deadline, in other words, it will only be a first step, A phase, one arrangement. The bigger, more structurally significant fights over defense purchases, over the future shape of the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement itself, which Trump wants rewritten in a more protectionist direction, are being pushed into a future phase of talks that hasn't even formally begun yet. The F-35 piece of this deserves its own explanation because it's been simmering for years, long before this specific tariff deadline existed. Canada originally signed a roughly 19 billion Canadian dollar contract with Lockheed Martin back in January 2023 to acquire 88 F-35A stealth fighters, meant to replace the aging CF-18 fleet the Royal Canadian Air Force has been flying for decades. But in March 2025, as the broader trade war with Washington was heating up, Carney ordered a full military review of that deal, citing concern about Canada becoming too dependent on the American defense industry at a moment when the relationship with Washington was deteriorating. Canada's Defense Minister David Eby confirmed to a Senate committee as recently as April 2026 that the review was still ongoing, with no timeline for a final decision, and that purchasing jets from non-American manufacturers, Saab's Gripen and the French Rafale have both been floated, remained genuinely on the table. Only 16 of the original 88 jets have actually been paid for and locked in, expected to arrive by the end of 2026. The other 72 are the ones sitting inside this trade negotiation as leverage, according to Globe and Mail sourcing. Washington wants Ottawa to commit to completing the full purchase as part of any broader deal. Complicating the picture further, Canada announced in July 2026 that it's joining the Global Combat Air Program as an observer, a British-Italian-Japanese effort aimed at a next-generation, sixth-generation fighter jet, expected to enter service around 2035. A hedge that doesn't replace the F-35 decision, but signals Ottawa is deliberately keeping its long-term options open. At that same NATO summit in Ankara in July, Carney announced Canada would spend roughly 800 million Canadian dollars on Joint Strike missiles from Norway's Kongsberg for its future F-35 fleet. A purchase that, notably, still assumes the F-35 program moves forward in some form, even amid all the public uncertainty. The Golden Dome piece is newer and less defined. It refers to Trump's proposed Continental Missile Defense Shield, combining ground and space-based interceptor systems, and Canada has been in early discussions about participating. According to reporting from the Eurasian Times and Aviation A2Z, Canada already shares NORAD, the Binational Continental Air Defense Command, with the United States, along with Five Eyes intelligence cooperation, alongside the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, meaning the security relationship between the two countries runs far deeper than trade figures alone suggest. That depth is exactly why analysts covering the F-35 dispute argue Ottawa is very unlikely to walk away from the American defense relationship entirely. Even amid this tariff fight, the two militaries are simply too interlinked. But it also means Washington has genuine leverage to point to here beyond tariffs alone, tying trade concessions to a defense relationship Canada can't easily unwind. It's also worth putting the overall trade relationship in scale. Industry analysis, cited by the Eurasian Times, puts Canadian exports to the United States somewhere between $403 billion and $420 billion annually, representing roughly 72 to 76% of all Canadian exports combined. Canadian imports from the U.S. run around $262 billion, about 59% of total Canadian imports. Add it together, and bilateral trade between the two countries touches roughly $720 billion a year. More than double what Canada trades with every other country on Earth combined. That single fact is the backdrop against which every provincial premier's public defiance has to be read. This isn't a minor trading partner pushing back. It's a country whose entire economic structure is built around access to the American market, choosing, at least on the alcohol question, to hold its ground anyway. It's worth pausing here to understand exactly what's driving Washington's dairy grievance too, because it's one of the three specific sectors named in Trump's Section 338 proclamations, alongside alcohol and autos. Canada operates what the White House fact sheet describes as a complicated protectionist dairy system built around tariff rate quotas. Those quotas heavily restrict how much American cheese can enter Canada at lower tariff rates, and according to the administration, those restrictions are considerably tighter than the quotas Canada applies to cheese imported from the European Union. Even though Canada has trade agreements with both blocs, from Washington's perspective, that's a textbook case of discrimination against American exporters specifically, not just generalized protectionism. The automotive piece of this dispute has its own texture, too. The decline in American vehicle exports to Canada, the 22%, $5.6 billion drop cited by the White House, didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened as tariffs made American-made vehicles more expensive in the Canadian market, and as automakers from other countries moved in to capture the demand that shift left behind. Doug Ford's insistence on linking Ontario's alcohol ban specifically to auto and steel tariffs isn't incidental. Ontario is the heart of Canada's auto manufacturing sector. and steel and aluminum tariffs have hit the province's industrial base directly. For Ford, alcohol isn't really about alcohol. It's leverage aimed at a much larger industrial wound. Let's talk about the money at stake if this deadline passes without a resolution. Nearly $20 billion in Canadian goods face a 50% tariff starting August 19th. That's on top of tariffs. Canada has already been absorbing for more than a year under earlier rounds, Trump imposed going back to 2025, including the 35% tariff he first threatened in a letter to Carney in July of last year, when he warned that any Canadian retaliation would simply be added on top of whatever new rate he imposed. That earlier letter, posted to Trump's Truth Social platform, also revived his long-standing claim that Canada wasn't doing enough to stop fentanyl from crossing into the United States, a claim that data has repeatedly shown involves only a marginal amount of the drug actually originating from the Canadian border, compared to other entry points. The economic ripple effects are already visible well beyond the tariff numbers themselves. Bloomberg reported that economists have flagged weak core inflation in Canada, combined with the pressure of additional American tariffs, as a combination that could open the door to further interest rate cuts from Canada's central bank. A sign that the trade fight is not just a diplomatic story, it's actively feeding into the mechanics of the Canadian economy in real time. But the alcohol standoff itself has had strange, almost surreal knock-on effects at the retail level. Back in August of 2025, Quebec's Provincial Liquor Board, the SAQ, revealed it might be forced to destroy $300,000 worth of American alcohol, product that had been purchased before the boycott began and had simply been sitting in storage ever since, waiting for a policy reversal that never came. Some of it now approaching its expiration date. Rosé, boxed wines, ready-to-drink cocktails, beer, all of it sitting in warehouses because provincial politics had frozen it in place. There's also a quieter, longer-term consequence taking shape inside Canada itself, separate from the standoff with Washington. According to Global News, New Brunswick's government has introduced legislation to make it easier to move alcohol freely between Canadian provinces, a step toward loosening the country's own historically restrictive interprovincial trade barriers on alcohol. It's a reminder that the boycott of American products has, in some corners, sparked a broader rethink of how Canadians trade with each other, not just with the United States. Public sentiment on the ground appears to back the boycott far more than it undermines it. CBC News spoke with Canadian consumers who say they simply haven't been buying American products at all since the trade war began, describing a shift in buying habits that goes well beyond what any single provincial policy mandates, suggesting that even if the political ban were lifted tomorrow, plenty of Canadian shoppers might not rush back to American shelves out of habit alone. That's a detail that matters strategically. Even a full policy reversal in Ottawa might not fully restore the American alcohol market that existed before March 2025, because consumer behavior, once it shifts, doesn't always snap back just because a rule changes. So where does that leave the actual bluff, the one in this story's title? Trump's position throughout this fight has rested on the assumption that economic pain applied through tariffs would eventually force Canadian provinces to fold on the alcohol issue specifically, because it's the most visible, most symbolic piece of the broader dispute, and arguably the easiest one for Ottawa to concede without touching deeper structural issues like dairy quotas or the F-35 purchase. That was the bet embedded in the 50% tariff threat. Apply enough pressure on a narrow, symbolic front and watch the provinces cave. As of this recording, that bet has not paid off. Every major province with an active ban, British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, has held its position publicly through its highest elected officials, mere days before the tariffs are set to take effect. Alberta and Saskatchewan, the two provinces that did lift their bans back in June 2025, did so more than a year before this current 50% tariff threat existed at all, meaning even that partial concession wasn't a response to this specific pressure campaign. In the current standoff, the answer from every province facing the immediate deadline has been the same: no. That doesn't mean Canada is walking away from the table. Carney's phone call with Trump, both leaders agreeing to what Carney described as an effort to accelerate negotiations in the coming weeks, according to reporting picked up through Bitget News citing Canadian officials, shows Ottawa still wants a deal. But wanting a deal and conceding the specific demand driving this round of tariffs are two very different things. And right now, Canada appears willing to absorb a 50% tariff hit on $20 billion of goods, rather than hand Washington the one concession it has demanded most loudly. It's worth being honest here about what remains uncertain, because not everything in this story is settled fact. Whether a Phase 1 deal gets signed before the August 19th deadline is, as of this recording, unresolved. Negotiators on both sides describe the talks as ongoing, with sources telling multiple outlets that a deal is possible but far from guaranteed. Whether Canada actually follows through on breaking off talks and retaliating, As Globe and Mail sources suggested is expected if no deal materializes, hasn't happened yet, and remains a projection based on anonymous sourcing, not a confirmed government policy. And the exact scope of what might be included in any partial critical minerals commitment this week is still described by sources as fluid, potentially amounting to little more than a broad statement of cooperation rather than binding terms. What is confirmed on the record from named officials? The 50% Section 338 tariffs, the specific citation of alcohol, dairy, and auto discrimination as the legal basis for them, the public refusals from Eby, Ford, and Moe, Carney's repeated not accept a bad deal pledge, Greer's warning against retaliation, and the broader list of American demands around F-35 jets, critical minerals, and Golden Dome participation reported through multiple named sources at the Globe and Mail. Zoom out for a moment, because this fight over liquor shelves is really a proxy for something much larger. The question of how much economic leverage the United States actually has left over a neighbor and longtime ally that has spent the past 18 months absorbing tariff after tariff without folding on its core positions. Ottawa hasn't matched Washington's tariffs dollar for dollar in most cases. It has, instead, relied on symbolic, provincially driven measures, pulling products off shelves, redirecting government purchasing, that cost American exporters real money without triggering the kind of full-scale trade war that would devastate both economies simultaneously. It's a strategy of controlled, visible resistance rather than open economic combat, and so far, it has held. Whether that strategy survives contact with a 50% tariff wall starting in less than a day is the open question hanging over this entire story. $20 billion in Canadian exports are about to get dramatically more expensive to sell into the American market. Some of those costs will land on Canadian producers and exporters. But American consumers and American producers who counted on the Canadian market, the liquor industry chief among them, given that Canada was once its largest export destination anywhere in the world, are absorbing damage too. Damage that's already visible in the trade numbers cited by the White House itself. There's a version of this story where, in the next 24 hours, a last-minute Phase 1 agreement gets announced, tariffs get delayed or scaled back, and this entire standoff becomes a footnote in a longer negotiation that stretches into a defense and energy phase later this year. There's another version where the deadline passes, the 50% tariffs take effect exactly as scheduled, and Canada follows through on the retaliation that sources have told the Globe and Mail is expected. Based on everything confirmed as of this recording, either outcome remains genuinely possible, and nobody outside that negotiating room in Ottawa or Washington knows for certain which one is coming. To be clear about where this information comes from, the tariff details and legal basis for the 50% Section 338 measures are drawn from an official White House fact sheet and a legal alert published by the trade law firm Wiley. The alcohol boycott timeline and provincial statements are drawn from CBC News reporting, including on-record comments from Premiers David Eby, Doug Ford, and Scott Moe, and from Prime Minister Mark Carney himself. The broader list of American demands, F-35 jets, critical minerals, Golden Dome, oil and gas exports, comes from Globe and Mail reporting, citing 5 separate sources familiar with the negotiations. Those specific details remain sourced to anonymous officials rather than named on-record statements, so they should be treated as strongly reported but not independently confirmed by either government publicly. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's comments and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer's warning against retaliation are both on-record statements reported by TT News and CBC News, respectively. The Quebec liquor destruction detail and the New Brunswick interprovincial trade legislation are drawn from CBC News and Global News reporting. So here's the real question, and it's one worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Has Canada actually called Washington's bluff by refusing to fold on the alcohol demand? Or is Ottawa about to find out the hard way that a 50% tariff is not a bluff at all? Provincial leaders like Eby and Ford are betting that public defiance plays better politically at home than a quiet concession would. But that's a bet about domestic politics, not necessarily a bet about who wins the actual economic standoff. What do you think happens when that deadline hits? Does Washington blink first? Does Ottawa eventually cave on the one demand it's held firm on the longest? Or does this turn into exactly the kind of prolonged damaging trade rupture that neither side has fully priced in yet? Let us know where you land on this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this as it develops.